All right, good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's discussion, The Case for Force Design 2030. I'm Damian O'Connell, your host and moderator. This evening's event is brought to you by the Warfighting Society, a network of communities of practice dedicated to military reform and after-hours professional military education. We've got chapters across the world, from Darwin, Australia, and Bavaria, Germany, to Texas A&M University and the School of Infantry East in North Carolina. If you are a U.S. or allied service member and want to start a chapter at your own command, send us an email at thewarfightingsociety@gmail.com. That's the warfightingsociety@gmail.com. You can also find us online at themaneuvers.org, as well as on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Just type in the Warfighting Society in your search bar and you should find us. Now on to why we're all here. Force Design 2030, the U.S. Marine Corps' plans and efforts to deter and fight future enemies, has recently attracted a lot of controversy. Earlier this year, a group of prominent retired Marine generals and officers released a series of articles strongly criticizing Force Design 2030. And this past April, the Warfighting Society hosted a Zoom event with Generals Anthony Zinni and Paul Van Riper, both outspoken critics of Force Design 2030. Force Design proponents have responded with their own articles and counter critiques, and tonight we'll get a chance to further explore the case for Force Design 2030. Helping us do that are four highly accomplished active duty Marine Corps majors. I sent out their bios via email the other day, so I won't say much about them except for a few bullet points. So first, we've got Major Brian Kerg, who just graduated from the School of Advanced Warfighting in Quantico, Virginia. Congrats to you, Brian. He's got 19 years of service with the Marine Corps and has deployed to Afghanistan, the Western Pacific, and the Indo-Pacific. Brian's a prolific author and has written for multiple outlets, including War on the Rocks, Proceedings, and SimSec, among others. Next, we have Major Ian Brown, who's the operations officer for the Brute Krulak Center for Innovation and Future Warfare at Marine Corps University. Ian's deployed twice to Iraq, once to Afghanistan, and once to Okinawa as part of the unit deployment program. Ian's the author of the acclaimed book, A New Conception of War, John Boyd, the U.S. Marines and Maneuver Warfare, which you can download free online, and I'd encourage everyone here to do that. After Ian, we have Major Evan Zach Ota. Evan's a career infantry officer with deployments to Iraq, Afghanistan, the Western Pacific, Southeast Asia, and Northeast Asia. He's currently the Australia and Oceania Desk Officer at U.S. Marine Forces Pacific, and he's written for the Marine Corps Gazette and SimSec. And last but not least, we have Major Matt Evers. Matt is a logistics officer who is deployed with Special Purpose MAGTF Crisis Response Central Command and Special Purpose MAGTF Crisis Response Africa. He's served with 2nd Battalion, 7th Marines, Marine Wing Support Squadron 271, and at the Basic School. And he's currently assigned to the Marine Corps Training and Education Command. And I think I'm getting a hot mic. It's off now. So the usual disclaimers apply to our panel tonight. The views of our panelists are their own and do not reflect those of the U.S. Marine Corps, Marine Corps University, or the Department of Defense. Our panelists will have about 45 minutes to present. After that, we'll open things up for questions. I'll ask our participants to type their questions in the chat box. I'll record them and then ask them in the order entered once we get to the Q&A. Alternatively, you can use the hand raise function in Zoom during the Q&A, and I'll call on you to share your question. Again, if you're not talking, please mute your mic. Brian will start things off tonight by talking about the Agile series of exercises and war games done in support of Force Design 2030. Ian will then continue the thread on wargaming and speak about some Force Design war games done at Marine Corps University, as well as Sebastian Bay's wargame Littoral Force Commander, previously known as Fleet Marine Force. Matt will then talk about contested logistics, perhaps the most contested aspect of Force Design. I had to get one pun in there tonight. And then Zach will finish things with comments on the concept of stand-in forces and the role of allies and partners in Force Design 2030. Final note, tonight's event is being recorded. We will post this tomorrow on the Warfighting Society's YouTube channel, as well as on our social media pages. So without further ado, I'll turn things over to our first speaker, Brian.
Hey, good evening, Damian and guests. Thank you so very much for having us. And it's an honor to be speaking alongside these other fantastic officers and Marines. So we'll jump right into it. The efforts to develop, wargame, test, and refine Force Design 2030 are substantial. And the Marine Corps' progress continues to be communicated frequently and publicly. But still, many aspects necessarily remain classified. And that prevents much of the national security community and others, members of your audience included, from perhaps not understanding the methods used to come to some of these conclusions. And some of them have generated significant controversy or resistance, which you've covered previously on your show. But here's the kicker, and here's part of the case for what I'm pitching tonight. Unclassified or publicly available information can provide an abundance of material through which independent assessments can be made. Anybody can look at a map, research military capabilities, calculate time distance factors, and reach sound and logical conclusions that are not beholden to the restriction of classification. And while there's still a degree of separation from true fidelity due to lack of access to some materials, I'd offer this. Even those with access to classified information, they don't have it because there's just too much. Or, consider other ways that information and capabilities are compartmentalized. And you know what I'm talking about. There's always going to be a gap between an informed vision and perfect and complete information. But we can hit that 90% solution and grapple with these ideas in turn in just the unclassified space. So given that, I'd like to take the opportunity to talk about an event that embodies the spirit of what I just described. It's that Agile series you mentioned, David. So just last month, the entire student body in this year's now graduated 2022 class of the School of Advanced Warfighting, the Double Deuce, designed and participated in such a series of unclassified war games. Now, notably, like I alluded to, we only used publicly available or unclassified information to inform, develop, and execute every event in the series. And despite those limitations, we discovered several key findings that I think, and maybe some of you will agree, are useful to focus future testing, analysis, and discourse surrounding force design. In particular, those relating to the Marine Littoral Regiment and the stand-in forces aspects of it. And more than that, this highlights the wider utility of unclassified wargaming to our entire community. I know Ian's going to talk a little bit to that as well later. And critically, it does something else for us. It allows participation and information sharing with members of allied nations who are often excluded from these same conversations due to the challenges of classification. I'm sure, Zach, you've got stuff to say about that, or you can sympathize with that point as well. So in turn, if we can bring them into the conversation, it can also provide assurance to those same allies and partners. So that's the premise, that's the thesis. Let me jump right into these war games. You can kind of understand what I mean. We developed and executed 3 different war games, which here I'll call the Force Employment War Game, the Assurance and Deterrence War Game, and the Sustainment War Game. And in the following discussion, I'm going to briefly describe each game's methodology and then the findings. And to be clear, these are far from conclusive, nor are they meant to be, but rather the findings provide data points that can suggest pathways for further exploration and further discourse. No one had an agenda to prove or disprove anything in the game. Nobody was saying, hey, you will make force design work. No, we said disprove force design. Rather, we set conditions against objectives and let the game discover what the game could discover, right? So let's start with the Force Employment War Game. The objective was to determine how the Marine Littoral Regiment, the MLR, how it provides viable military options for the naval campaign from competition to crisis and below the nuclear threshold. We set the game in 2030 and postulated a scenario in which China was attempting to isolate Taiwan. We also assumed that 12th and 3rd MLR were fully operational capable, everything that force design aspires for it to be, and that they were employed as part of a naval task force to maintain an open sea line of communication with Taiwan. The game built out appropriate force packages and then tested them under these conditions using the operational wargame system, which again, I know you're familiar with, and many other of your audience may be. But that's a game board-based wargaming toolkit and a game that's you've seen in use in other scenarios as well. So the game developed dozens of findings, but I'm just going to unpack 3 right here tonight. 1, in the game, the MLR ended up serving as a non-traditional covering force. The MLR used its non-lethal assets, deception, joint offensive, and cyber and space capabilities that it was tied into to intercept, engage, delay, and deceive the enemy. And this suggests that the MLR, when integrated with the proper joint enablers, it can serve as not only a screening force, but also as a covering force, which we weren't expecting initially. Number 2, the primary benefit of the MLR was its value as a sensing capability vice as a kinetic strike asset. Now, the MLR, it did possess within the game some credible lethal capability, but that value, it was bound within a finite window of time and space that had to be coordinated with effects provided by other forces and domains to maximize that effectiveness. And that suggests that the MLR might be better served by weighting what it is best at, its role in reconnaissance and counter reconnaissance, which it sort of corresponds pretty closely with what some of the guidance of the annual update to Force Design 2030 that just dropped last month. So we kind of, I don't want to say confirmed that, but it corresponded with that. And the third finding from the game is that ambiguity regarding the location and the depth of the MLR in combination with the ambiguity and depth of the rest of the naval force caused the red team to commit, red forces to commit significantly more ISR and naval forces than were necessary to mitigate the actual threat that was present in a given location. And that effect became more pronounced when combined with effects that degraded Red's ISR capabilities. And that suggests that the MLR provides an asymmetric advantage in terms of the resource commitment and effect on the enemy scheme of maneuver. All right, so that was that first game. Let's roll into the second game, the Deterrence war game. And the objective of that game was to explore how the MLR provides a credible force to assure allies and contribute to deterring adversaries. And using a somewhat similar scenario to the previous war game, we employed 3 teams, one representing the US, one China, and one Japan. Now, each team developed courses of action that were programmed into Command Professional Edition, or Command PE, which is a computer-based simulation of joint combat. It allows for much sharper modeling simulation, right? Now, modifications were made after each run of Command PE, and the players then assessed whether the MLR constituted a combat credible force and what level of joint and coalition support might be needed for the MLR to achieve that combat credibility. And for the purposes of this game, we defined combat credibility as the ability of the MLR to inflict a mission kill on at least one destroyer found in a Chinese surface action group. And then using those results, the team assessed whether the MLR helped deter the PRC or assure allies using categories found in the Deterrence Operations Joint Operating Concept. So we weren't just swagging it, we weren't just making it up. We actually used metrics we found or categories we found in joint doctrine. Now, as with the previous war game, lots of findings to unpack. I'm just going to list 3 tonight. 1, combat credibility was tied to coalition support. The MLR was identified as combat credible as long as it maintained some coalition force support. And 2 factors contributed to that rating. First, the MLR required sensing and intelligence data from coalition resources. And second, it required the employment of its long-range unmanned surface vessels to penetrate the defensive network of the Chinese surface action groups that it was fighting. Now, while the game did not explore the many other joint options that could have offered the same or similar capabilities, the limitation of coalition support might make sense in a scenario where the MLR seeks to maintain minimal signature within allied territories. Is just one example. Finding 2, to be effective, fire should be multi-domain and tightly coupled in time and space. So in general, the naval strike missile range of 100 nautical miles was sufficient to reach a PLA target, but this range did not always allow for coordinated effects with other fires platforms, particularly those operating from other expeditionary advanced bases. But modifying the force packages, such as extending the range of the naval strike missile, which we are aspiring to do, or introducing other coalition forces into the battle networks of the Marine Littoral Regiment, enhance the effectiveness of the MLR's contribution. Finally, combining MLR deployments with other deterrence and assurance mechanisms significantly enhances the MLR's effectiveness. The team primarily used, again, those ways that were identified in the Deterrence Operations Joint Operating Concept to measure the effectiveness of deterrence and assurance throughout the war game, and found that the ways contributing to this were forward presence, force projection, active and passive defense, and Zach, you'll really appreciate this one, security cooperation and interoperability, right? So those are the 3 findings from that game. Okay, well, I'm gonna speed through this last one because I know I'm pressing up against time. I know we're gonna have some other discussions of sustainment later, but we did run a sustainment war game, which the objective here was to determine the cost effectiveness of MLR deployments. It used a similar scenario to the above, but it also incorporated the use of Marine expeditionary units. The methodology was developed to determine sustainment under 4 conditions: the MLR in competition, the MLR in conflict, the MU in competition, and the MU during conflict. Sustainment requirements were estimated and tested using planning tools developed by the Marine Corps Logistics Operations Group, as well as historical MU deployment data for validation. And once again, many findings and these are suggested by inclusive, but we're going to just hit two real quick. And I won't expound upon them too much, but they are: one, that in conflict, the Mu is more cost effective to sustain than the MLR, but in competition, the MLR was more cost effective to sustain than the Mu. Now, again, this isn't speaking to combat efficacy. This isn't speaking to effects on the enemy or how we measure those costs in a qualitative sense, but simply looking at dollars spent. That's how we were talking about cost effectiveness. So to wrap it all up, 3 war games providing a collection of findings to inform the discourse, all done at the unclassified level using open source information. So if anyone else wants to mix it up, if you have concerns about is this going to work, how much testing has been done, if you want to improve MLR and force design as content, if you want to play the Op4, if that's something that you feel like you haven't had the opportunity to do, if you want to red team the concept, you name it, you can. And this opens it up to our allies and our partners as well. Hey, Damien, that's all I got. Back to you, or if you want to pass it off to Ian from there.
Thank you, Brian. Ian, you're welcome to start when you're ready.
Yep, I'm just gonna be that guy and have slides. But like I said, I'm gonna try and blast through these. They're more just jumping off points because a lot of the stuff I'm going to talk about are not things that were generated by myself or the center, but by others. But I want to make sure I capture their outcomes effectively. So just Damien, can you see the first one?
Yep, good to go.
Okay, great. So like Brian said, happy to be here. Looking forward to this discussion, and I'm always excited for a chance to talk about wargaming because it's one of my passions, and I feel very lucky that I get to do that as my day job at the Kulak Center. So I'm going to jump off a lot of what Brian said here, and to include the note that there's a lot you can learn using unclassified war games, and kind of as he noted, SAW does a lot of this as part of its curriculum. And the first 2 examples actually I'm going to talk about are some different SAW, some individual student SAW projects, which at the Kulak Center, we've been able to sort of boost and highlight as part of the annual Innovation Summit that we do every academic year. The Innovation Summit includes the top student research projects from all the schools, UWS on through the War College, and SAW always has lots of contributions. And as it happens, the last 2 academic years, we've had 2 separate projects focusing on force design using commercial war games. And then I'm going to talk about a third one, which is kind of a more unique grassroots war game that was created originally as an educational tool, but has gone viral, as they say, and spread widely across the Fleet Marine Force, both operational units and other schoolhouses to use to do their own training and education. And sort of as an offshoot, it's provided a very large data set, to my knowledge, probably one of the largest ones that's out there, on stress testing, the MLR, other force design changes, and how all these things interact with the joint force. And this is all going to kind of, again, build on Brian's point, which is that, there have been some critiques about how the force design process in terms of how wargaming has influenced that. Not a lot has been done. What was done was not really transparent or accessible to wider audiences to discuss how it was done. And the things I'm all going to talk about here are things that are where students using open source, as Brian said, war game aspects of it. They use platforms, as Brian said, that are readily available to anyone who wants to get their own, to do any more, to sort of game some of these things more on their own. And then the methodology and results of these research games, as well as the grassroots game, they're all freely available to anyone who'd like to learn more. And when I get to the end, I'm going to put a foot stomp to the Kulak Center social media empire, because you can learn a lot about it on the things that we try and share. All right, so first thing I'm going to hit is, this is from academic year 21. This was a SAW warfighting project done by Major Matt Van Arsdale. And you can see the question, sort of the initial issues in the research question, and his specific one was looking at, can the force design formations operate outside of the South China Sea region, which has sort of been the focus of effort, although it's not the exclusive AO talked about in the force design changes, but it's the one that's certainly gotten the most attention. So the game he used is called Flashpoint Campaign Pro. This is it's a commercial game. I believe it comes from the same manufacturer as Command Professional Edition. It has what we call in wargaming a we go turn structure. So both sides will input their orders, unit assignments, what have you, and then you sort of hit play, and the computer plays both of those at the same time. Both sides watch as their order inputs unfold, and then you get to resolution, and you do the whole process over again. So it's not a it's not a traditional turn-based I go, you go. It's we go, and we see what happens together. But it does use a sort of a traditional hex-based map and sort of traditional unit counters, as you can see there on the bottom right. So what Major Van Arsdale did was he modeled two different formations. He modeled the MLR as in, again, this is academic year 21, so in year 2020, 21, what the MLR was being discussed at that point. That's obviously that's changed in the last year or so since this was done. So just sort of take that for what it's worth. And then he also modeled what he called the 2030 MAGTAF, which was sort of the things we have now and projecting out what capabilities they would have based on, upgrades, improvements we're saying we're going to do to the systems that we have now. But, it's not adding any of the new systems that the MLR is talking about. So he ran 4 sets. He did 2 sets, one each of those initial formations. And then he sort of, from the outputs of that, he would modify both of those formations and then run 2 more sets. Each set was 15 simulations for a total of 60 simulations. So 60 data sets. And the scenario was a Russian seizure of the Suwalki Yap, which, for those not familiar, that's basically the little strip of land in between Kaliningrad and let me believe Belarus, just south of the Baltics. So what were the outcomes? So interestingly, both of the formations performed poorly. He notes in the MLR in set 1 and set 2 averaged a marginal loss result. The 2030 MAGTAF did a little bit better with a contested result. Although, as you can see down in the bottom right, it's a little bit grainy, but the overall casualty rate, you could argue the difference between a marginal loss and contested is almost irrelevant, because you're still talking between 40 to 50% casualties, whatever the formation. Although both formations did inflict very large casualties on the Russian adversary. However, both formations were unable to retain or secure the objectives in the game. As I said, they were both very lethal. You get those casualty rates, but they're also very fragile in terms of their what was left. As you can see the casualty rates. So lessons that he pulled out of this, and they applied again to both formations. So this was sort of noting that neither formation was absolutely perfect for a future scenario. Both had gaps that needed to be covered. Both of them lacked mobile protected firepower. They were too light to shift Russian mechanized forces back into counterattack. Ironically, the best asset was a modified LAV, but he mentioned in his paper that particular LAV is no longer really on the table, so not going to be a factor in the future. He noted reconnaissance was key. Both of the formations were very fires heavy, which required a much greater degree of situational awareness, and the dense web of Russian air defense assets quickly overwhelmed the limited ISR and drone assets, which limited the overall impact of the fires. And finally, logistics. Because both formations were fires heavy, the fires were used to inflict heavy casualties, ammo expenditures were very high, and logistics needed to sustain both formations were greatly outpaced by the volumes of fire they wanted to deliver, which required additional airlift or ground logistics. So lessons that he took for this for force employment on both tracks, again, was one, looking at fire support. He noted that the Rogue fires launcher was very effective and mobile, but as with the logistics, the fires missions rapidly depleted its launchers, causing gaps in fires coverage. So he noted that for him, this required a complete rethinking of how to do fires with this particular piece of equipment to make it effective. And you had to think a lot about rotating individual launchers in and out of support to prevent gaps in fires coverage. In terms of the effectiveness of both formations as a conventional deterrence force, he looked at both deterrence by denial and then deterrence by punishment. He said deterrence by denial, neither really achieved, because the Russians could achieve their objectives 96% of the times in the simulations. So deterrence didn't really do much there. And then by punishment, if the Russian algorithm was willing to sacrifice those people in those initial thrusts, which, as you look at the casualty counts again, they did, the Marine formations will take so many losses, they won't be able to punish the follow-on Russian waves. And then finally, what does it say about employment options to the Joint Force Commander? Because of both formations' inability to take offensive ground maneuver actions, this severely limits the ability to conduct joint forcible entry operations. So either those formations have to get deployed prior to conflict, which requires a prediction of the future we're historically not good at, or the formations have to be deployed to uncontested areas post-conflict initiation, which restricts, these restrictions mean the Joint Force Commander has limited options for joint forcible entry and would be confined to uncontested land or air entry. So that was the first one. And something I just realized I skipped on my intro, but I want a note here. You'll see in some of the outcomes of these games, I'm not taking per se a pro or against FD 2030. What I think it's important to note that these are this is more evidence and data to go into the discussion, because there has been a tremendous amount of wargaming done to take a look at aspects of the future as well as legacy options. Okay, so second project was won by Major Clark Smith, and actually this is from this academic year, so I believe this is a classmate of Brian's. In this case, he used the Command Professional Edition Brian already talked about to run a set of iterations with a sort of a stripped down, very small component of the MLR, a small littoral combat team against a Chinese threat to the Senkaku Islands. And his desired outcomes were determining, well, he basically wanted to see what this like stripped down LCT could do by itself, because that would help inform what other things he would need to add to that LCT, both from the larger MLR, from other EABs, as well as the joint force, so that you can understand what it can and can't do, and what you would have to, what an MLR operations shop would need to ask for. And yeah, as you can see, his target audience was the MLR OPSO. Some of the assumptions that went into this game, we're not going to get the things that we think we're going to get, at least not all of them. And for any acquisitions program that, that's probably par for the course. MLR might be employed before it's ready. Navy and Joint Force may not get on board until the MLR approves itself. And then he, for sort of testing purposes, he felt it was valuable to, like I said, strip it down as a standalone force to identify those gaps that you would need to fill with either future acquisitions for the Marine Corps or request joint capabilities to support. So just as not to insult anyone's intelligence, but this is where the Senkaku Islands are. You're looking at those islands between Okinawa and Taiwan. So he similar to the first one, he ran several different sets. You can see them there. So 3 different sets, each set going from 1, 2, 3 was he added more stuff to, and then for vertical if you want to, and then horizontal, he ran different configurations with those particular force packages for a total of 30 different iterations. So implications that he found, some of these are the same as things Brian talked about, noting things like the Naval Strike Missile, for example, needs greater range, needs more overlap with itself, as well as supporting overlap from other fires and ISR capabilities. It says there the MLR can't currently do anything against larger than maritime militia. I would just note again, he deliberately stripped it down to an LCT, which is which is a very small unit. But you need more LCTs, you need more AABs, and you're going to need a joint force there, which, I think a lot of the discussion in the past 2 years has been, we're not going anywhere by ourselves anyway. So we're going to be there with some sort of joint force. He recommends live fire training to uncover additional challenges. And he was hoping that the info derived from this game could inform such live fire things. And then the final point is he generated this and made it public as part of our innovation summit, so that an MLR staff doesn't start with a blank slate if they look at this particular problem set. And I'm willing to bet some of them are. Okay. Last thing I'm going to talk about, I won't make Sebastian talk unless he really wants to. This is the grassroots game that I mentioned that was originally developed as an educational tool for Marines, other members of the Joint Force, and as Brian also mentioned, allied nations and partners. I would note that this game's gone through hundreds of iterations, and having, especially Marine Corps University, having the international military students there, we had heavy participation from them, and it was always value added, because a lot of the scenarios are their backyard, their home turf. So they can add things that, those of us who've either never been over there, or it's more a conceptual thing to us, because it's not our backyard. That intimate knowledge is just not there, and so they were really, really tremendous assets. So, game designer, who I will call, he is on here if you want to ask him directly about it, but I'll try and take as much of that as I can away from him, because he often has to answer questions. So he's a civilian right now, but he has prior service as a Marine. He teaches wargame design at Georgetown University. And initially, this project, it was developed as a passion project for his graduate students to work on during COVID lockdown. As a former Marine, he thought it'd be interesting to build a game based on a Blue Force built around the proposed MLR construct at the time. So again, 2020 timeframe we're looking at. MLR supported by joint capabilities, and then put that against a Red Force modeled on future Chinese naval and ground capabilities. As game design progressed, he approached Marine Corps University through us at the Krulak Center to see if there might be any broader interest in the PME realm for using this game as an educational tool. We thought that there was, and so we worked with his team to refine the game mechanics, put it in front of students, create new scenarios, explore different geographic locations, and help raise awareness of this game as a possible tool for use across the Fleet Marine Force. I would humbly submit we were pretty successful in all that, and the game's been used directly to support PME curricula, to include at the enlisted schools. We've used it for cross-school extracurricular experimentation and competition. Dozens of schoolhouses and operational units across the Fleet, Joint Force, and allied and partner militaries have also requested and gotten access to this to improve their own training and education. In terms of the gameplay itself, it's a tactical level game looking at units of platoon or section size or individual naval vessels on the map. Units include ground assault, long range strike, interception, or logistics units. And in some cases, as you can see on the one on the top left here, some units have a combination of those capabilities, such as ground assault and long range fires. But I think the really interesting piece of that is beyond those core units that are on the map, through the form of cards, you get access to a huge variety of joint capabilities that you can tailor into your task force as you're approaching the scenario. These capabilities come from the realms of fires, maneuver, C5 ISR, information, and interception. And sort of how this all comes together is the players will walk up to a scenario. They'll have a task organization of red and blue units. They can sort of mess around with that, reorganize it if they want to. But then they have a limited amount of what are called command points, which are these numbers on the cards, but it's representative of how exquisite, if you will, these capabilities are. So if you want to ask for higher level capabilities, like a B-2 bomber, you can do that. It's going to cost you. And the point is that it reflects higher level capabilities are going to be more exquisite. They're going to be harder to access, so you may get fewer of them. Conversely, not depicted here, but if you want to invest more in like tactical ISR, right, like little drones going up there, those are cheaper. You can get more of them, but they're not quite as capable as things like low Earth orbit satellites. So it's a task organizational challenge to all the players. What do you want? What do you think you need based on your assessment of the scenario? To date, like I said, there have been hundreds of iterations of this game under many different scenarios played, both on the tabletop and the digital versions. About 50% of the players are from the Joint Force, and the rest range from U.S. defense community to partner allied militaries to secure and civilian security studies programs, think tanks, et cetera. Very, very wide, diverse audience. So I threw some of the trends up there that have been captured in after actions. I'm not going to go through those verbatim, but I'll let you read them. But I want to frame them in the following context. So given the game's sandbox design built around the MLR, and with all of these iterations, like I said before, FMF Indo-PACOM, soon to be Littoral Commander and the commercial version, for those who are interested in acquiring a copy. You'll be playing with naval infantry, not Marines. Small trademark issue, but it's a great game anyway. You should go get it. The game has generated a large data set to reveal whether the MLR gets consistently crushed or is just not survivable on a future battlefield, unable to accomplish its objectives, et cetera. But from all these iterations, that does not seem to be the case. It seems to be more that The equipment sets and structure of the MLR are less of particular importance than what the players did with them in the context of understanding or not understanding the mission requirements for the scenario in front of them. Like I said, equipment sets are the starting point in each scenario. You have the task org that you're given, but that's not the terminal definition of what you can do with those things inside the scenario. Those capabilities come from how the humans on the team make decisions on their employment, on how they further task organize based on the joint capabilities that they request, as well as what the humans on the adversary side do with their own weapons and capabilities. So the MLR stuff doesn't just sit there waiting to die. The adversary has to take action to find and attack it. I would note that a big chunk of this game is completing the kill chain, if you will. So all of the units start in a hidden fashion. So before you get to shoot at anything, you need to use some form of ISR to reveal a unit's location and then decide whether or not you want to prosecute it. That's a key decision, because in deciding to prosecute it, you're going to reveal your own unit's location and make yourself vulnerable to counterattack, counterfires, what have you. And so the recon, the counter recon, the use of ISR, constant movement, concealing yourself, are all things that play into this game beyond just, you know, the lethality value of the units in there. The MLR's new capabilities create new problem sets the adversary has to solve. So the trends that we're seeing were not about, again, whether the MLR survives or not, but more about what the MLR and future joint capabilities do on a future battlefield, as well as some insights into what that future battlefield might look like, understanding that in a war game, everything's abstracted. So you can't say it's going to be 100% predictable, but you can see trends in an abstracted fashion. And as you look through the trends that are on the screen there, you know, none of them really seem like earth-shattering revelations, but the many iterations have revealed trends that speak to the question that unintentionally, like I said, this is made as an educational tool, but outcomes have spoken to questions of force design, cover down on challenges that most concern the players here were not necessarily the ones raised in critiques of force design or the war games used to generate force design and shape it. So close up here between Brian's discussion, the examples I covered. I think it's clear there's been a lot more wargaming done on force design than has been discussed recently. Given all of these tools are publicly available, I think this trend is going to continue. And at the Krulak Center, like, where our doors are always open to have people come in and use these tools, we'll make them available to tinker with as you will. Or they're all open source platforms readily available to the public to do their own stress testing, if you will. And the methodology and results of these war games, as I said, are also publicly available to anyone interested in learning more. And in that vein, I'm going to promote the Krulak Center's YouTube channel in particular, where you can find all the original videos that go into more detail on these research projects, as well as a overview of the FMF game developed by Sebastian. All right, thank you. I am done.
Ian, thank you so much. I think, Matt, you were up next.
Awesome. Well, first, thank you, Damien, for putting this professional discussion together. Logistics is the pacing function, so I think it's fitting that I'm trailing some of the speakers here. Humbled to follow up with these speakers. You know, they've written some great articles and other things out there. Just a reminder, these opinions are my own. So on contested logistics, often as logisticians, we get fascinated with the box and line chart. And also focus on tactical level logistics capabilities. I think we need a lot more focus on the operational level logistics. And I think also part of this discussion is, as Carl Forsling put in his recent SimSec article on the Marine Transformation Week, a lot of the rhetoric with MLR EABO gets put in the same spot with Force Design 2030. And Force Design 2030 also involves a lot more things, supporting things to train, organize, and equip to ultimately create a service that's more credible, capable in competition, and better postured in conflict. So with that, you know, this being the Warfighting Society, I'd like to quote Clausewitz here. He, you know, his seminal piece really focused on the warfighting, but early in the document, he does recognize the importance of logistics. He doesn't quite use the term, but he puts it in a different way. So, quote, the whole of military activity must therefore relate directly or indirectly to the engagement. The end for which a soldier is recruited, clothed, armed, and trained, the whole object of his sleeping, eating, drinking, and marching is simply that he should be there at the right place and the right time. And so I'd like to open the aperture on more than just tactical level logistics and talk about some of these other things. So first on oplog, from a naval tactics perspective, if you look at NDP-4, it's got the same logistics principles that we have in our doctrine and also in the tentative manual for EABO. NDP-4 also recognizes and puts up front some key logistics processes and functions that aren't really emphasized in TM EABO or in some of the Marine Corps doctrine. And so first of all, let me focus on acquisition and sustainment. So on the acquisition side, with these new formations like the MLR, or really how we're fighting as littoral forces and composite warfare construct, fighting a naval fight, really what we're offering, the Marine Corps is offering, is an asymmetric capability besides a capital warship. This asymmetric capability is offering the virtue of mass without concentration. And so you're getting that capability in the recon, counter recon fight, sensing, and a small fires capability. You're almost building the same capabilities as a warship, but not quite. Nonetheless, you're still beholden to some of the oplog requirements that a fleet requires. So, but the problem is, since you're not a warship, you don't have that endurance, you don't have that staying power to be out at sea because you're distributed, small, low signature formations. So you still need a replenishment underway. You still need some kind of distribution from a hub and spoke forward, that operational level logistics. You still need a different version of a shipbuilding capability, right? So how are we going to rapidly build these asymmetric capabilities? What kind of supporting infrastructure are we going to put in place to build these platforms and capabilities? The other piece is these ships require depot level maintenance. So what is our sustainment plan for these platforms that we're building? Are we synchronizing acquisition with sustainment? So on these asymmetric capabilities, I think there's a great article out there by David Allman, Proceedings, Don't Buy Warships Yet. And he offers a couple options in there. But let me explore this with the new TTPs is, if we look at technologies and how they commoditize and proliferate, they can really unlock some new different ways of warfighting. So for instance, the diesel engine unlocked tanks, aircraft, and so that created mechanized warfare, naval aviation, different way we did combine arms. Look at close combat lethality today, all these converging technologies that made drones more capable has also created the ability for loitering munitions, as we're observing in the Russian invasion Ukraine conflict. As we also observed recently in the Nagorno-Karabakh Second War. So the loitering munitions, that technology, it's to democratize air forces, artillery, and armor. If you look at the PLA, the proliferation and growth, maturity of the precision strike regime, that's extended the WES and pushed, put those forces at risk. And so, you're going to need a stand-in force then to provide that credible deterrence back. And precision strike isn't just with the PLA, it's also found itself in less capable formations like the Houthis, for instance, as we saw in Saudi Arabia and some of those littoral choke points. So on acquisition, what are the capabilities we're trying to build? And some of these platforms can really be systems of systems. For instance, like, don't just build an amphibious combat vehicle. Really, you're building a system that has an open architecture to put these other best of breed systems on there, right? So we could put an EW capability on there. We could put a C2 capability on there. We could put a loitering munition on there to offer additional capabilities. The speed at which this is happening, so platforms, just like ships, just like some of these other platforms, take years to build. We're fighting through different POM cycles. So there's that consideration. But if you look at other development, the systems on a system, for instance, that EW capability or that connecting capability, the pace at which that is moving is really at Moore's law. So it's, the processing power that's doubling every 2 years and getting less expensive. That's the pace at which those platforms need to move at. There's a hardware aspect, and then there's a software aspect on top of that, right? So the ability to synthesize information, to create some autonomous capabilities, to protect your system, to integrate that system into like a live virtual constructive environment, that is all software. And that is moving at the pace of DevSecOps. So how fast are you deploying? Or is it every day, every couple of days, every week? And of course, that software on top of that hardware, it's giving you a lot more capability, but it's also creating some new vectors for vulnerability, right? On acquisition, we cannot forget about our training systems. So back to the Clausewitz quote earlier, there's a lot of different things that can increase the lethality of the force. And so it can lead to additional options to experiment and deploy more lethal force. I think when we look at things like large scale formations fighting, if we also look at experimenting and fighting an electromagnetic spectrum, we're going to need a live virtual constructive environment. If we also don't want to intentionally reveal things and keep that in-house, but play with live forces as well, we're going to need that live constructural environment. But to do that, you're going to need a network that's going to be able to put all those things together. And I think we should look at the Navy for what they've been doing for a long time, where their platforms, their warships, they're just not out there selling around. They're actually using those same warfighting capabilities, air defense, targeting, sensors. They're using those in same systems in a live structural environment. And so I think we should learn from that and integrate that in our platforms that we're also building. There's a lot of discussion on the war games up front. I think that is good, that we've got that good analytical rigor to figure out what capabilities we need. I think, and as Brian mentioned, this is difficult to kind of signal to everyone, as a lot of this is classified. But I do think where we can find opportunities to bring people into the war games and share some of these outcomes is beneficial, especially to industry, right? If we're talking about capabilities that there are gaps in logistics, in air defense, and things like that, we need to signal what are the requirements to industry so that they can posture to then begin building those systems, right? There's a lot of money and limitations of physics, for instance, to build a large unmanned aerial system, which could have huge benefits to CASEVAC, to distribution in an environment where you've got the tyranny of distance, Indo-PACOM. But if we're not signaling what is the requirement, no one's going to put the money behind it to keep developing that capability. I think with some of the things we're also building, there's some creative ways where we can get about our capability gaps, right? Government owned, contractor operated, contractor owned, contractor operated. And I think one of the easy examples is what we're seeing in unmanned aerial platforms. Back to industry, modernization of the defense industrial base. If, for instance, look at shipyards, right? We modernizing shipyards. If we're trying to build these unmanned surface systems, right? Really, we're organizing a new workforce, new technologies, new infrastructure that's going to build that. So are we signaling that that's the right requirement? Are we putting the right people in the right place to develop these unmanned systems? And that could really unlock some new business opportunities and other things. Within defense industrial base, we need to be careful with some of our exquisite systems where these are very complex supply chains. They're not necessarily like contained within the DoD. You've got multiple tiers and tiers and tiers, all the way to Joe's garage, to your big primes. So do we have cognizance of these supply chains? Because they will affect force design. They will affect these future formations. You've seen it in the news right now with trying to turn on and rack up these production lines to give the Ukrainians more javelins and more Stingers, because all of a sudden there was a huge demand, right? Look at the F-35. There's a lot of different parts all across many different nations with the foreign military sales that are involved in that. So you've got a big complex supply chain there. The synergy between the acquisition and sustainment decisions. I think we need some unity of effort within the Marine Corps, unity of command to synchronize those decisions. For instance, the JLTV, right? If we're going to modify that to be something else, to start slinging missiles, then what is the sustainment plan for that? Are we going to only have the JLTV for as it is for 5 years? Or are we going to modify it? Because 5 years from now, or later, some of those JLTVs are going to start going into depot level maintenance. And so you're not going to be able to turn on those production lines and those facilities to start taking care of that depot level maintenance now. The same on the issue of divestment and investment, right? If we're getting rid of LAVs as we know them now, well, how does that affect our production lines and our sustainment plan for that? We're going to have to adjust some things. Same thing with the ACV coming online. Not just the depot level maintenance, but the supply support behind this. Being in a tactical formation was already experienced this with the fielding of the JLTV, just the supply chain issues. And as we're divesting and investing and bringing on new capabilities and equipment, what's on the shelf to support that stuff? Is the Marine Corps being a good customer to Defense Logistics Agency? Is our organic industrial base equipped to provide a capability to the total force through, for instance, advanced manufacturing, right? Could we develop better parts, build those at the point of demand? When you look at point of demand rather than the point of supply, I think you also come up with different outcomes on what you need. So, point of demand, if we can reduce the load and the requirement on the infantrymen on some of these exquisite systems, especially from an energy standpoint, how do we do that? Using alternative fuels and things like that. I think when you look at electrification, everyone wants to talk about batteries. Well, the problem with batteries is what's powering the batteries, and usually that's a hydrocarbon. So you don't really get away from the fuel problem. So you've got to be really creative in how you're getting after generating things or reducing demand at the point of need. Same thing if you're looking at something from the point of supply, especially from wholesale distribution, some of these spokes, right? You're also coming up with different solutions, especially for fuel. Just a few other things on the operational energy piece. Walker Mills has written about this. Eric Lampacher has written about this. He's also been on the CRULAC podcast as well. He's got an innovative solution out there. The secure alternative fuel environment, where we're using activated aluminum to generate hydrogen, using that hydrogen to transfer into energy. That unlocks all sorts of possibilities and how you pre-position things. With hydrogen, you can also use that to create synthetic fuels through the tripper flush process. So that's also creating some new possibilities. That's where we could provide greater range, greater endurance to some of these ISR platforms, right? Make them more attritable, provide them more capability just by changing the energy system that we're using. On distribution, right? We need all the different options. Walker Mills wrote a lot of articles about this with seaplanes, clandestine logistics. Marine Corps needs a few good mules, but really I think all the options need to be on the table, from undersea, surface, air, ground. You need to provide that commander all the different options. And I think that's not just a tactical level focus. That needs to be looked at from home station out towards the second Allen chain, first Allen chain in, because really it's the positioning of the operational level logistics that's going to set up success for the tactical level logistics. To figure out what that looks like, you're going to need data-driven decision-making. So you're going to be able to, you need to be able to monitor, you need to be able to forecast, how are we synchronizing this data? How are we having visibility? If we're also doing this, how are we managing our signature management, data transport? It's a very complex issue to come up and model these supply chains, figure out possibilities, and create these decision support tools so we can solve these logistics problems at speed and at scale. The final thing with distribution and logistics is facilities. So, you know, that hub and spoke, where are you basing things? Where do you have access? Where is the infrastructure mature enough to support these things? That's where I think allies and partners really come into this. From a facilities perspective, you know, those positions forward, we really need to think of them as forward battle positions, and your family just happens to live there with you. And in fact, you know, the homeland is contested as well. And so we really need to look at the resilience and the capabilities of our facilities here at home station. Back to the training piece, you know, the ranges, the facilities to support that lethal training, that's a part of this logistics problem as well. And the last thing I'll close with is people. So if you're trying to have a lower signature, provide more capability, maybe deal with more exquisite systems, to include data-driven decision support tools, you're going to need a more capable Marine, a multifunctional logistician in the grandest sense. So I think we need to eliminate some of these rice bowls, and on the engineer community, supply community, O4 community, really need to look things from a perspective of a grand logistician. And if you're going to make someone that's more capable, has more depth and breadth in what they know from a total end-to-end logistics perspective, you're going to need to change how we train Marines, how we recruit Marines, and how we retain Marines. You'll have to change the incentives for promotion and whatnot, not just structure, not just TO, if you want to create that more multifunctional logistician. So in closing, covered a lot of ground, but I think contested logistics, we need to open up the aperture, look at our people, talent management, operational energy, facilities, operational level logistics, data-driven decision-making, and finally, the training piece of this, our training systems and our ranges and facilities that are supporting these more lethal forces. Over.
Matt, thank you so much. And I think we've got Zach up next.
All right, thanks, Damian. Yeah, you know, a hard act to follow from around the horn here. But likewise, I'm honored to be in a company of such distinguished professionals who are here to discuss, you know, the really important topics for us in the Marine Corps and our national security going forward. You know, so tonight so far, we heard a lot of concepts, you know, a lot of the wargaming results that justify, you know, Force Design 2030 and its associated warfighting concepts. You know, in my opinion, the case for Force Design has been made, and the Commandant has clearly stated his position and has clearly stated his reasoning going forward with these initiatives. So instead of, you know, rehashing that debate and, you know, adding on to the wargaming and concepts piece, you know, I want to dive into a little bit of the historical context with our allies and partners that drove Force Design 2030 in the first place. And specifically, you know, I want to talk about how the Marine Corps did or did not contribute to deterrence in those cases. And then, you know, take those lessons learned from that historical example and go forward. So first off, you know, starting with deterrence, I'll discuss, you know, kind of what deterrence is, right, and why it's important to us. So first off, you know, I think the Commandant's been very clear that deterrence is the #1 objective of Force Design 2030. He's clearly stated that in his Commandant's planning guidance. It resonates throughout all of the associated warfighting concepts because we want to first deter conflict with the pacing threat, and then if we have to, then fight. You know, so that also reinforces, you know, the Secretary of the Navy's guidance, which is stated in October 21, that states the top priority for the Department of the Navy will be to develop concepts of operations and capabilities that bolster deterrence and expand our warfighting advantages vis-a-vis the People's Republic of China. So it can't be clearer, in my opinion. But, you know, to dive down on what deterrence is, Professor Christopher Toomey of the Naval Postgraduate School likes to say, effective deterrence is the product of capability, credibility, and communication of the threat to the adversary. So tonight, for the Marine Corps purposes, I want to focus on what those capabilities are and how we can credibly deter an adversary, specifically the PRC, in future conflict. And to do that, I'll talk a little bit about the historical context that drove FD 2030, which was the South China Seas conflict and the South China Seas militarization by the PRC. And I think those lessons will be very informative for us in the future again. As Robert Blackwell and Philip Zelikow say in a great article in Foreign Affairs, in a future conflict, we don't want to say, quote, the most powerful country in the world did not have credible options prepared for the most dangerous military crisis looming in front of it, unquote. And I think, if we look back to our most recent past, we will find that the Marine Corps of 2012 to 2015 did not have credible capabilities to deter those incremental advances by the PRC. So let me dive into it. We'll talk a little bit about the South China Seas case, and I'll use the Scarborough Shoals incident beginning in 2020 to kind of frame our discussion. So for those unfamiliar, the Scarborough Shoal incident, as we know it and as we refer to it, really started on April 8, 2012, when the Philippine Navy discovered 8 Chinese fishing vessels anchored off the waters of Scarborough Shoal, which the Philippines had claimed and which the PRC had been incrementally advancing upon. So a couple of days later, after confirming the presence of these Chinese fishing vessels, the Philippine Navy investigated, confirmed that there was some illegal fishing going on in the area, attempted to arrest the Chinese fishermen, and that then ensued an ongoing conflict between the PRC and the Philippine government, which by our definitions was below the threshold of armed conflict. But as we'll talk about later, I think really set the stage for increasingly threatening advances below the threshold of armed conflict. We attempted to mediate that issue in 2012 between the PRC, the Philippines, and the United States, but as we know, that was largely unsuccessful. So I won't go into the reasons why of it, but the conflict ensued all the way to the point where in 2014 and 2015, the PRC had erected barriers to Scarborough Shoal and effectively denied access to the Philippines Navy and the Philippines government to those fishing grounds and to those territorial waters which they had claimed. So I think that example is instructive. As we now know, the Scarborough Shoal incident in 2012 really was a precursor to wider PRC militarization of the South China Sea, which we widely recognize as a failure to counter effectively with the means and the capabilities that we had at our disposal. So I think we have to ask ourselves, the Marine Corps, how capable and how credible was the Marine Corps of 2012 to deter such PRC aggression in the South China Sea? So if you look at it first from our position, because an important part of credibility is, are we in position to deter or to respond to a threat? So I would argue that in 2012, the Marine Corps was definitely not in position to credibly deter that threat. If you look at the global situation in 2012, the United States as a whole had 77,000 troops in Afghanistan. I was one of them, full disclosure. So was the Commandant of the Marine Corps, General Berger at the time, who was the Commanding General of 1st Marine Division Forward. And we had the preponderance of our forces were there, right? About 1/3 of our combat power under 1 MEF Forward was in a landlocked country fighting a ongoing counterinsurgency. So not only did you have 1 MEF Forward, but you had 1st Marine Division Forward, which had 2 regimental combat teams with a Marine Air Wing Forward and also a Marine Logistics Group Forward, and attachments and enablers, right? So although we were, and we still are, a lethal and expeditionary crisis response force, I argue that our priorities were muddled and we were out of position to respond in the priority theater because we had focused elsewhere and we had developed capabilities to field elsewhere in the world. And speaking of those capabilities, I think we have to look at, do we have the capabilities to respond even if we were in position? And again, I argue that we were not. We did not have those capabilities. For reference, Scarborough Shoal is about 198 kilometers or 123 nautical miles west of Subic Bay, which many people are familiar with. So again, I ask, in 2012, what did the MAGTF of 2012 possess to affect a situation in the Scarborough Shoal? If you look at our aviation capabilities, obviously we had, fixed wing aviation, AV-8B Bravo Harriers, F-18s that were optimized for strike and for attack, not necessarily for persistent ISR or to gain maritime domain awareness. And even the assets we had to gain maritime domain awareness were very limited. Our RQ-21s had an effective range of 50 nautical miles, or about 93 kilometers. So our aviation assets weren't optimized to understand the maritime domain. And even our ground-based fires largely couldn't affect the situation. Aside from your classic, 155 artillery, even if we took our most capable asset at the time, which was HIMARS, and even if you fitted it with the longest range, weapon we had, which is the ATACMS at the moment, that only ranged out to 140 kilometers, which is about 87 miles. And that doesn't even target moving ships, right? It's meant for land-based targets with precise coordinates. So even if we were in position, even if we were focused strategically, and even if the Marine Corps had the will and the mandate to counter such advances to one of our most critical allies in the region, I argue that we didn't have the capability to do so. So we effectively were not a deterrent. And although I don't levy this on the Marine Corps, I don't levy it on the Department of the Navy, not even the United States, because this was Chinese malign influence and malign activity that led to it. We have to ask ourselves, what did we field in 2012 that could have changed the calculus of the situation? So I argue that the Marine Corps 2012 and the MAGTF of 2012 was more of a sledgehammer than a scalpel. And because we didn't have that precision, because we didn't have that nuance, because we weren't integrated and persistently engaged with our partners, we were left in the shed, whereas other competitors were doing surgery in the South China Sea. Okay, so now how does that matter for us today, right? Well, first off, I argue that those threats below the threshold of armed conflict still exist. As recent as May 2021, the Philippines government detected 287 vessels of the People's Armed Forces Maritime Militia in their exclusive economic zone. And even in November of 2021, Chinese Coast Guard vessels fired water cannons on Filipino supply vessels, effectively denying them access to Second Thomas Shoal in order to protect those PAFM vessels and their fishing vessels in waters that the Philippines government had claimed. And more broadly in the region, that problem persists, right? So if you look at the East China Sea and the Senkakus, which we just mentioned in some of our wargaming scenarios, those threats exist very much in the Senkakus as well. In 2017, Japan reported 696 Chinese frigates and submarines in the vicinity of the Senkakus, and that's just in 2017 alone. And then we'll talk about the rest of the cases, just for our security purposes here. But those threats still exist. And if we're looking to a future conflict, I don't think we can discount those threats below the threshold of armed conflict as a precursor to actual armed conflict itself. We have to look at a example in the South China Sea as potentially a vector or a beginning for how a crisis or how incremental territorial grabs could begin in a cross-strait invasions of Taiwan. Okay, so now what's changed? What's the positive? What's the upswing of this, right? And why are we talking about it here and about for force design for 2030? Well, I'd argue that the Commandant's Planning Guidance, Force Design 2030 of itself, EABO, a concept for standing forces, and some of the organizations we're seeing being fielded, specifically the MLR, are changing the calculus. It's a watershed moment within the force design of our allies and partners in the region. So one of our most influential partners and allies, the Philippines government, right, has took cues from us and are now fielding very capable forces to do exactly what the Commandant of the Marine Corps stated we should do, which is hold naval targets at risk and figure out how we will integrate in a naval joint and interagency operation. So the Philippines Navy's developed their active archipelagic defense concept, and within that, the Filipino Marine Corps has developed their archipelagic coastal defense concept as well. And in 2021, they fielded their coastal defense regiment. So, before the MLR was even established, our allies and partners were leading their way based off the cues from the Commandant and Force Design 2030. You may have recently seen that that unit, the Coastal Defense Regiment, just recently procured $368 million worth of BrahMos coastal defense cruise missiles from India. You may have also recently seen that the 3rd MLR, in their first deployment with an ally and partner overseas, they deployed to exercise Balikatan and worked with the Philippine Marine Corps Coastal Defense Regiment. So I argue that Force Design 2030 is not only good and necessary for us to develop capabilities and credibility that will deter future conflict, but it is really driving and mutually reinforcing a lot of initiatives that our allies and partners in the region are developing on their own. I don't think we would have seen that if we had not seen Commonwealth's planning guidance over the Force Design 2030 and its associated concepts issued. I can talk about it a little bit more too in the question and answer session, but those changes I think have been reverberating across the region. So partners in Japan, as I mentioned, are making similar moves. They established the Amphibious Rapid Deployment Brigade in 2021, a 2,100 soldier strong force with a mandate to defend and, if necessary, retake Japanese islands that could be the targets of invasions. Likewise, the Australian Defense Force, one of our most capable and closely integrated partners and allies in the region, is making similar moves to develop long-range precision fires, longer-range integrated air and missile defense assets, and really working to drive closer interoperability in our command and control systems. And I think, again, all of this would not have been possible without Force Design 2030 and without the vision and the initiative that the Commandant of the Marine Corps laid out for the rest of the regional Marine Corps and naval infantries around the world. So in closing, for my segment here, we do face a daunting challenge going forward, right? But I think it's surmountable. Andrew Erickson of the Naval War College calls it a decade of maximum danger in the Western Pacific due to a confluence of factors. But I think the capabilities that we've established with our allies and partners and within the United States Marine Corps are changing the calculus for the better and changing it to the point where we could credibly say that we are deterring a conflict based with the capabilities that we are rapidly onboarding in the Western Pacific. So I'll pause there. I'm very happy to discuss further and answer some questions, and hopefully Damien will have some time for the group to do so.
Zach, thank you so much, and thank you to the other panelists. So we'll turn to Q&A. The two questions that I see in the chat come from Gary G.I. Wilson, Colonel Wilson. First question from Colonel Wilson, I think this is for you, Zach. In 2012, what was the U.S. Navy's capability to counter China? He mentions the Marine Corps as well, but I think that if I'm reading the question correctly, he's curious about the Navy's capability to counter China.
I think great question and fair question as well, right? Because we are definitely integrated with the Navy, and now we are realizing the importance of having a unified effort within the Department of the Navy. I don't mean to speak too much on behalf of the Navy there, because the tightest focus is on Force Design 2030 and the United States Marine Corps. But I would say since 2012, both the Navy and the Marine Corps have significantly realized that we need to focus on China. I think that's clear from both of our planning documents and our shared vision through the Tri-Service Strategy for Cooperation. And although we may not have been in the best place, both within the Navy and the Marine Corps, to counter such threats, I think now we are increasingly focusing on such a threat, and we are fielding capabilities within the Department of the Navy to respond more effectively and more credibly in the future.
Brandon, I see you want to ask a few questions. I'll get to you in just a moment. A follow-up question from Colonel Wilson is China, and I'll pose this to the whole group, or all of our panelists. Has China not already built 3 artificial islands and is already currently funding building 50 plus outlying airfields in the South China Seas and Pacific, creating more challenges and mismatches? I'd rephrase that slightly, more challenges and mismatches to the force that Force Design 2030 is moving toward. So any of our panelists are welcome to respond to that.
Yeah, I'll jump on it. And all those efforts, this reflects that this is not just a static thing. It's not like China is threatening in X way, therefore, if we do force design, we'll solve China forever. No, of course, they're a live resisting adversary. They're going to adapt. And the way they're adapting, I think, it just drives home the necessity of the underlying logic of the concept for stand-in forces. I don't know how we would get after that if we undid Force Design 2030. I don't know what utility we would have as far as utilizing tanks to sink surface action groups, right? I challenge somebody to try to find a way to do that with the way we used to do things, as opposed to the direction we're going. This is a game. It's a constant battle. We're going to adapt, counter-adapt, and change the changes. And I'd almost be disappointed in the China we've come to know if they weren't trying to outpace us right now. But it just feeds into the logic of Force Design 2030, as far as I'm concerned. And I'll ask any of the other panel members if they have different or similar.
I had a couple of things that it's sort of, I guess, more an agnostic answer, but Yeah, I mean, it's a definite challenge because now it creates more places where China can put things that, you know, threaten that entire theater. On the flip side, though, I'd note, and I don't want to overstate outcomes or things we saw in the war games that we've conducted or we've seen the schools conduct, but you know, that's also throwing out more targets that are vulnerable to our own WESs and those of our allies that are out there, and those are static targets. You know, I think one of the greatest challenges for both sides in the Pacific is that, you know, a lot of the large you know, the big built up areas, you know, we've got Guam, we've got certain bases up and down the Japanese island chain. Yeah, they're static, they don't move. So that's a pretty easy thing for the Chinese military to hit. But each of these is its own static thing that is going to become vulnerable um, to the things that we can bring into the area, as well as the things our allies have in there. As a second thing is from you know, the war games that we looked at is sustaining those islands. I mean, you can put stuff out there, but that creates a huge logistical burden to keep those things to keep them operating at peacetime. But then if you start putting them into a fight, you know, that's now, you know, 50 different places that you have to supply, potentially through a contested zone, because we're not just going to sit back and let them resupply their islands at will, right? You know, we're probably going to be doing our best to hammer both those islands and go after whatever you know, sustainment methods they use, whatever surface or air connectors to keep those things supplied. So that it, you know, it creates more places for them to put stuff, but it also creates more, you know, targets and opportunities for us to affect their ability to influence that. And last thing about the logistics side is the we have a much more exercised, and I'll ask Matt to jump in on this as well, but our logistics capabilities have been a lot more exercised. You know, we do sort of default to the Iron Mountain sometimes, but in terms of how to push logistics, how to resupply things, whether it's on an island, whether it's unrep, we're really good at moving stuff around. We have years, if not decades, of experience doing that, to include under combat conditions. That's a problem set that you know, China has probably practiced and trained to a certain extent, but I think it hasn't really been stress tested, if you will. Matt, if you've anything to add to that.
Yeah, just to riff off of that, Ian, great point on the sustainment. I think that's a very challenging thing to war game, especially all the and model and simulate across all the different classes of supply. But it's certainly something that we need to get after. I think when we talk about, you know, that network that you talked about with distribution, you know, if we're building caches or creatively prepositioning things, not just with our standard preposition ships, but perhaps through known exercises, other merchant vessels like barges, other contracted vehicles. I think there's other ways to preposition things. If they know Pacific theater, it is a different theater than World War II, where you were pushing a lot of things in. I think there's a lot more things there now. But you know, how are you updating that prepositioning for those dynamic forces coming in? To the Iron Mountain, I don't think the volume is quite going down. For instance, I look at the Army, their division formations that they're trying to fight in now, and them not falling in on an Iron Mountain capability set. That volume isn't going away. They just have to get a lot better at dynamically deploying things and prepositioning in smaller pieces. So I think at that scale, that service is doing that. I think there's some lessons that the Marine Corps can also learn with that. If those kind of decisions are very difficult, I think we're all comfortable with, or have all known the TIPFID, I forget what the acronym stands for, you know, the deployment, distribution, whatnot. We're all used to nitty gritty pencil stubbing Excel spreadsheets, trying to figure out how to deploy these capabilities and what the phasing should be. If we're trying to dynamically do that very quickly, we need software and decision support tools that allow us to do that quickly and to model things to understand different outcomes before we execute on things. So a couple of things there, but Ian, I'm glad you brought it up.
So I'll just add, Brian said in the chat, Matt, I don't have time to talk through it all here, but I will say that the SOS sustainment war game grappled with multiple classes of supply in great detail and provided very granular findings regarding cost and finding regarding how to reduce that cost. So thanks for adding that, Brian. Brandon, I know you've been waiting to ask a few questions. Please feel free to do so.
Yeah. Hey, thanks, Damien. Okay, so I watched the last panel we had. I've read the articles. I think at this point it's fair to say that despite a lot of the the retired general officers' concerns about force design, the current combatant commanders don't have the issues that General Rosini brought up. The SecNav's office, OSD, the Joint Staff, they've all concurred with it. The Congress has continued to pass funding for the Marine Corps and has been briefed on force design. So we're moving forward with everything, and the people in power and the people with the decision-making abilities don't have the concerns that others do. However, I think the Commandant recently, in his release of the Force Design 2030 update in May, dropped a couple, what I call subtle cries for help for the Marine Corps. And I'll go through these. So part one, on page 1 of the Force Design 2030 update, and it's a short documents, less than 20 pages. He says in there, similarly, Force Design 2030 assumes, keyword assumes, adequate support for its key components, such as logistics modernization, amphibious shipping, operational lift, and littoral mobility. Now, we all know that when you begin planning, you have to make assumptions in order to continue planning. But part of that process is to go back and either confirm or deny if your assumptions are correct. 2.5 years into this, and I would argue that an assumption about the Navy coming through with amphibious shipping on the front end is probably a poor assumption to make. However, the 2018 NDAA did recommend a 355 ship Navy. So, given the time that Force Design was initially released, that could be a fair assumption. However, 2.5 to almost 3 years into Force Design, we're still assuming that the Navy plans to provide adequate amphibious shipping and our littoral mobility. And at this point, we need to go back and probably take a hard look if that is a valid assumption. Because in April of 2022, less than 2 months ago, the CNO in their shipbuilding plan to Congress has us down to a 280 ship Navy by the end of the decade, and they're cutting primarily amphibious ships. So, that is the timeline by which we are expecting the Navy to fully source our requirements for force design. The Merchant Marines, which is our other kind of, maybe we can use the Merchant Marines to assist us in moving around, I would argue are not in necessarily a better position. Is it time to say that this is a poor assumption and say, we need to go back to the original planning and say, all right, this is a bad assumption. Let's remove naval ships from our plan and ask ourselves, how do we execute force design going forward? Then on page 6, he says, in his issues requiring further analysis, part B, logistics. In accordance with recommendations originating from the ongoing MWX, the service must develop concepts for resilient logistics webs in contested environments with multiple options for support to include distributed networks and multi-domain delivery methods. Now, all 4 of you guys have talked extensively about logistics, and I'm sure everybody on this panel and everybody here at some point or another has heard the phrase, amateurs talk tactics, professionals talk logistics. I've never had a logistics officer or a senior infantry officer miss an opportunity to remind me of that. Yet, all we're talking about here is the tactics. And every time we talk about the logistics, it's too hard. Matt, you literally just said, it's too difficult to war game. Yet in all of my exercises at the 2MEF Sim Center, which I've done plenty of, when you go and set the game up, the programmers will shut the logistics piece off. And I would argue that that is the easiest thing to war game, because you make assumptions like every Marine's going to consume 1 gallon of water a day. If I have 300 Marines and I have 600 gallons, that cost me 2 days, and you count down because it's basic math. So it's probably the easiest thing to war game, but we turn it off because it makes the war game difficult. It's not that logistics is difficult to war game, it's that it makes the war game difficult for us. Everything we do is focusing on tactics, which is being amateur. We're not talking about how we plan to actually logistically sustain this. And if we can't even figure out how to do this in a peacetime environment, how in the hell are we going to do it in a contested environment when our, we plan to be inside the WES, when, the ACMAC wrote in his article in Proceedings a few months back that, these forces will sustain themselves for days at a time. So we're going to go inside the WES with ships and connectors that the Navy doesn't have, that they don't want to go inside the WES, hence why we're supposed to be there to resupply these units, during a conflict. I don't see that that's going to happen. And that is my concern with force design. I don't necessarily care about the tanks or the artillery. I think modernization is great. I love the idea of long range precision fires and destroying, strategical ships for the PLN. But we have to be realistic and about what are we capable of doing. So I yield back.
And anyone on the panel is welcome to respond.
Yeah, I'll open it up. So I think there are two questions or issues there. One was the issue with ships, and one was the challenge of logistics sustainment. And I will say, first of all, certainly there is incredible weight to that concern. And I think I would agree among many of the concerns. I'm not concerned with the logic of Force Design 2030. I buy into it. I believe it. I think the case is made. I think the vulnerabilities are, to your point, will we, the Marine Corps, get the other things that we need, i.e., will the Navy support us with the shipping requirements? Will the Joint Force support us with the other things that the Joint Force should support us with? This gets into budgeting discussions, and there's many unknowns. And so, if I were to answer one key question, you said, "Hey, if we take ships off the board, what do we do with force design?" Well, I think we have to say, if ships are off the board or the shipping requirements off the board, we as the Marine Corps would have to turn back to the Secretary of Defense and say, "Hey, Mr. Secretary, those tasks you gave us in your national defense strategy."
Hey, Brian, I'm sorry to interrupt. I think your audio's kind of fritzing a little bit. I'm getting indicators from other people. They can't hear you.
Sorry about that. Let's see. Test 1, 2, 3. How am I now?
That's
Good now?
better. Yeah, that's good. Thank you. Sorry.
No worries. Thank you for letting me know. So I'm not sure where I came in or where I dropped off, but I'll just summarize it by, if we don't have the shipping requirements needed to accomplish the missions in the tasks assigned to us in the National Defense Strategy, we as a service would then have to go back and say, we can't do what you told us to do. And I think that might help set certain things in motion. In addition, I think the case is we're getting some buy-in with Congress as far as support for shipping. And as far as perhaps the hesitance from the Navy to provide us with certain things, I think I would offer that there are other solutions than the law itself. There may be a law-like things that we could perhaps purchase or lease or otherwise require to fulfill that requirement. But again, that's a lot of ifs, but there are always going to be a lot of ifs. But I think you have valid concerns with
Brian, but it's not that whether or not the Navy is going to. They've said they're not. Their shipbuilding plan calls for a decrease in amphibs, and everybody knows that. I mean, if you've been in the Marine Corps for more than 10 minutes, you've seen the forecasts for amphibious shipping. And we all go on about the Congress mandates these things. There's a lot of things that Congress mandates the Navy to do, from carriers to nuclear submarines to nuclear deterrence, that, they're behind on. It's not just amphibs. So we, as a Marine Corps, take it personally and say, well, the Navy is just ignoring us and not giving us our amphibs, and they're being mean to us, and we need to go to Congress and tell them to enforce it. They're dropping the ball in many areas outside of amphibs. So of all of their priorities, we may be the lowest, but they're not fulfilling most of those priorities. So it's not realistic to think that all of a sudden amphibs is going to become the number one priority. And even if it did, guess what? Their number one priority right now is not meeting the requirements anyway.
So to answer that, I would say we would either need to, if we would believe that wholeheartedly, if there's no way that will change, then we as a service would have to say, hey, Mr. Secretary, everything you told us the Marine Corps to do and prioritize, we can't do that. What next? And go from there. Secondly, I don't think, short of that we are in a position to be like, we're not going to do that because we don't believe the Navy's going to follow through. So we're going to ignore the national defense strategy, Mr. Secretary. We're going to throw it out the window. I don't think we're in a position to do that. To answer your second concern with respect to logistics sustainment, yes, agreed, 100%. Sustainment, logistics, very hard. We should give it even more of an emphasis. But to say that we don't do it, I think, again, the third wargaming, and my apologies, I didn't really get into it in too great of a detail, but we went over consumption rates over all classes of supply, or almost all the classes of supply, for all those four scenarios I described. Endurance, sustainment requirements, to include under scenarios of the estimated cost for friendly combat losses and replacements, and I go on and on. There's like 20 tabs to the appendix of sustainment and supply issues that we looked at in just this one war game. So now I think you are correct in your assessment that we don't like to focus on that because it is hard. But to say that we don't do it at all, I don't think, well, let's say that's not true. We are doing a lot of that, but we should do more of it because that is the hardest part of this whole thing. I'm right there in your camp with you. And I'll open it up, I'll offer or ask the other panel members if they have other thoughts on that.
Other panel members, if you'd like to add your thoughts.
Yeah, Damien, if you don't mind, I'll just add a couple points there for clarification. I'm not a logistician. I'll be the first to admit that, and identify my my gaps in knowledge. But I will say that with our allies and partners, we are advancing, logistics and sustainment initiatives to this day. So, we discussed that it's difficult to wargame and it's difficult to, conjecture. But, there are tangible advances and achievements being made. We are reaching level of interoperability with some of our higher end allies that, we can produce and field the same munitions for some of our high end precision weapons. We are advancing, acquisitions, cross service agreements, and logistics agreements with some of our higher end partners to facilitate and ease the burden of logistics and sustainments in the first and second island chain. So just because it's difficult to wargame doesn't necessarily mean that the concept itself is unsustainable, or that what we're doing in the Pacific or in the regions around the world for that matter are necessarily unsustainable. But I do agree, it is a concern. It's the one that we're working towards advancing every day. As Colin says, logistics is the pacing function, and we're looking to get after that here.
Yeah, we're beating up logistics a lot. Zach, I like what you really added to the discussion with allies and partners, right? If we look at shipping, the amphibious shipping, I think that number should include our allies and partners, right? We've demonstrated that we can land F-35s on, coalition partners. The foreign military sales piece, I think, is a key aspect. I think one of the challenges with that is some of these nations, they want some of the exquisite platforms that we have. And of course, that comes with a chain of other things, training, all the different support systems, the supply chain behind that. So perhaps maybe we can't sell them an exquisite system like an F-35 or something like that, but we could offer something else to build that interoperability, have that, for instance, have those common use ammunition, common use weapons, common use interoperable C2 systems. I think you bring up a really good point, Zach, to bring in our allies and partners into this logistics sustainment discussion.
All right, and in the interest of time, we'll move on. Dan, I know you had a question or two about modeling and simulation.
Yeah, hey, thanks, Damien, and thanks all the panelists. I really do appreciate all your hard work. This is a difficult task, and you guys have put in the man hours, obviously. I guess my question is, what kind of real world tests have been done to try to confirm what you've come up with in modeling and simulation. So I've done some work on this, and I know that modeling and simulation is useful. It can kind of point you in the right direction, but it can't actually get you to the target. If it did, we would not have any failures in systems like the F-35 or the littoral combat ship or anything like that, because all of those things were designed using modeling and simulation. And right now they can't even finish the joint simulation environment for the F-35. So I don't know. It concerns me that we are completely redesigning the Marine Corps just based on from everything that I've heard here tonight, just based on war games and modeling and simulation.
I'll try and hit some of that, and I don't want to get too far out over my skis here, because I'm essentially reporting what I've what we get fed from others. But it's a fair point, or like taking something from a computer and then making it is probably missing a step. But I do know, it's been noted in the previous force designs, and then for the folks out on the West Coast, at least, there's been an MLR stood up as a test bed, as an experiment, and that's one aspect of it. On other aspects of it, I know I don't want to necessarily put him on the spot, but we have Lieutenant Colonel Travis Ward on board here. So looking down at what 2MEF is doing, not just 2MEF, but also what the entry-level schools are doing, that they're becoming test beds as well, to use the training they're doing anyway with new Marines, and putting some of these new capabilities in their hands and seeing what happens with them. And I know that's not an exclusive list, but we have, and in fact, I'm going to try and get some folks down from 2MEF onto our podcast here shortly, because a lot of the things they've been doing I can't articulate here, so I'm going to get them on to talk about it specifically. And I think that goes back to I don't know who mentioned the sort of cry for help thing from the latest force design update. But one thing that, and sort of from our seat, that we noticed as an outreach entity for EdCom is doing more outreach, essentially saying what's going on, and sharing that information more widely, which I think has been recognized as a shortfall in the efforts over the past couple of years. It should not be out to just myself or some active folks on social media to highlight onesies and twosies. There needs to be a better effort to explain. And I think one of the things that the critics of force design have pointed out, and I think it's fair, is there could have been a better job in explaining the 5 Ws, how things were arrived at, and then from 2019 forward, what's been done to experiment and test, because that stuff has gone on, but it has it's been shared in fits and spurts. And so I think part of the thing captured in the force design update just recently was that needs to be better. And if I could, Damien, if I could just go back to GI's thing real quick here, since we are crunched on time. The thing about the people and technology that China can put in that area, I agree. I think it's a problem, and we know a lot about, and we've had a lot of, serious concerns about the technology they can put out. I would submit we know less about their people, and I think that some things that we make the technology 10 feet tall, but what about the people who actually operate that? And not to overlearn lessons, but I think there are some insights to be gleaned from Russian performance in Ukraine, because I think there are similarities between shared traits between authoritarian military cultures as compared to military cultures under, more Western or democratic or non-authoritarian regimes. And so the things that have popped into my mind are, they have a lot of people too, right? What is the quality of those people? What are they allowed to do? How are they trained? How are they educated? And I think some of the differences between us and the quantity of soldiers, sailors, what have you, the PLA, PLAN can all put on the table are things that are not necessarily captured in force design, but I think things like talent management will enhance on our side. But I think to that term of mismatches is we have a mismatch that I don't think we quite appreciate. And I think we're starting to see the value of that mismatch on the Russian challenges. Some of that is questions of trust and decision making, right? Does the PRC, does the PLA senior leadership trusts their lower echelons to make the independent decisions needed to effectively employ all those awesome weapons that they have. An anecdote I like to use when we talk about this is we've all seen the range rings of death of all the long range missiles that, China's got tons and tons of, and they cover everything. And, if you stay in Hawaii, maybe you'll be okay, but any closer, you're going to die, right? Well, those are just lines on paper. There's a human being somewhere in that chain that has to push a button and get permission to push a button to launch that system to engage a US target. Does the equivalent of the corporal or the sergeant at that launcher have the authority to do that? I would submit probably not. And I think part of the reason why is that under authoritarian regimes, their biggest concern is never external, it's internal. They don't trust their own people. And so the PLA and the PRC leadership is not just going to push down authorities to do certain things because they don't know if those lower downs are going to come and be like, we have lots of weapons and we don't really like the fact, that you have a social media tracker that can basically force us into destitution if you don't like what we say, right? Their constant fear is going to be internal. And so their empowering of those lower echelons is going to be less because they fundamentally don't trust them. That is going to delay, degrade on a good day, their ability to employ those weapon systems to their maximum capacity. And then, so taking that anecdote a little bit further, Sergeant so-and-so asks Captain so-and-so, goes up to Colonel so-and-so, can I launch this weapon? By the time that authority has come back down, where's that target? It's probably moved, which is going to, their own command structures are going to complicate their ability to use those things effectively. And let's say even if magically on D-Day, they flip the switch and they tell all their soldiers and sailors, hey, yeah, you go ahead and make decisions on your own. They're going to have no habit pattern to do that, right? They're not going to have the mental reps and sets to just go and make decisions on their own because they've never done it before. And that's not something, and you can't flip that switch, right? Like you can't create a culture of mission command on a dime when you've spent decades cutting that out as much as you can, dissuading it, crushing it, not even making it an option, right? That's going to be a challenge for them to employ those weapon systems in a future conflict. And last point I'll make is that, on the US side, I know we often complain that, the truth doesn't always match the advertising in terms of how we do mission command, right? We've all got stories of being micromanaged or having, somebody looking 5 echelons down on what we're doing and having generals asking what, PFC so-and-so is doing on a fire team because they can, right? We've all got those stories, but I think the thing to think about is what is our ability to do mission command and make those decisions at the lower level relative to them, right? And I would submit that we have probably a significant relative advantage that we don't necessarily talk about, but it's there, right? And even on our worst days of mission command, it's still been scattered enough, and we all have enough experience with it that, I can turn to, Corporal so-and-so, tell him to go do something, and it's not going to be like he's never been asked that before, right? Heck, he might have been like chomping at the bit to go do this thing, and finally somebody's told him to go do it. So I think that institutional culture, even the days where we're grinding our teeth about it, I think that's a manpower advantage that we don't have to flip that switch. We can bring that to D-Day. I think that's going to be a challenge for all of those people that the PRC has, and I know that quantity has a quality all of its own, and the quantities of things they have, and the goodness of the weapon system, I don't dissuade. It's going to be a challenge. Can they effectively employ them? Will they be given the authorities to do that? Will they be able to maximize the employment of those things at the farthest, most effective ranges to really make it hard for us to come in? Or are they going to wait for a colonel or a general way up the chain to tell them they're okay to do that? And at that point, we're already deeper in, and they have to find us again. So I'm not trying to diminish that problem, but I think we talk a lot about the technology. We don't talk as much about the people and what they are allowed to do.
Alex, I know you've been waiting to ask your question. You're welcome to do so.
Thanks. Good evening, gentlemen. Thanks for being here. I really appreciate it. My question is regarding training. So I'm currently a midshipman at university, and a lot of this stuff that we're talking about with force design, is stuff that isn't taught in any of our naval science classes, isn't really part of the curriculum. So we're still looking at combined arms as artillery, as armored divisions, what have you, versus the new guidance in force design is to start looking at combined arms as information, as cyber, as space. And one of the, I actually played FMF as my final project in class for naval science. But one of the struggles that we had with that was the equipment was less so a confusion point and more so our tactical or technical knowledge of the way to employ these pieces of equipment in a different environment or more amphibious environment, right? Because it's different from the artillery and the basics of combined arms that we've been learning to this point. So I guess my overall question for any of you who want to speak on it is, if we are moving in this direction for force design, how are we going to start training your lower level candidates, junior officers, junior enlisted, some of this information? Because from what I've seen so far, it's kind of major to colonel or colonel back to colonel, major to major. And I'd say among my peers, very few, if any, really have a solid foundation of these upcoming changes. And if we're going to make such sweeping strides with the entirety of the force, what is your recommendation, or what do you think the guidance for training should be going forward?
So I'm happy to jump on that, and I'll admit I come to this less from the training and the education side, but I think the challenges are the same. Whether you're in the field or the classroom, who's giving you the information to help you understand it. I was only partly joking when I said if you've already played FMF, I think that's great. I would say one piece of that is is to do that more and to try and find other players who can bring some of those perspectives to the table. I realize that might be a challenge in an ROTC environment, but if you haven't brought your instructors to play around the table, I would ask them to come, because I think some of the greatest value from, not just from the FMF game, but also from some of the other sort of more open game things that we've done at EdCom, is bringing those other services, other branches of combined arms, getting them around that table to feed those perspectives into the game. Because you're 100% right. Like I'm a pilot. I don't know really anything about artillery employment except how to stay away from it. So I don't test the big sky little bullet theory. But if you can get some of those people around the table, they can give some really good insights on maybe this is why you shouldn't use this thing. Or as we've seen, bringing in other members of the joint force. I think Sebastian's got a fun story that I'll try and retell, is bringing an Army player to one of these scenarios. And one of your choices on the blue side for a joint capability is THAAD, right? Terminal high altitude air defense. And the Army guy was saying, based on the threat, China's got all these ballistic missiles that they might bring to the fight here. You're going to want some THAAD, right? It's expensive, but you're going to want it because nothing can do what it does. Well, the USMC player, not knowing anything about it, didn't invest in it. They invested in some less capable air defense systems, and lo and behold, a bunch of ballistic missiles blew up their logistic support, which made the rest of the game pretty miserable because they blew it up early. So again, I realize in an ROTC environment, it may be hard to find those players, but I would I'll volunteer the Crew Lab Center first. Start with us, send me a message, and give us an idea of what education you're looking for, who you would sort of want to get around the table, and then we'll see who we can put you in touch with from there. And I'm also going to volunteer Sebastian, because if you've already played, he regularly runs the digital version. And when I was talking about those percentile cross sections of players, that's where you can get some of those insights. You plug into the digital version, you'll probably get some players who've done it a lot, so they can tell you what they've seen both inside the game and then how the assets inside the game, from a force design perspective, how they work, what joint things you might want to ask for. So we can have another conversation, but just ask. We can help you find some resources, because you're certainly not alone. And in our new digital post-COVID world, you should not have to wonder who to ask for. We'll try and help you with that. I know that doesn't solve your media problem, but we can try and find resources for you down the road.
Yeah. Hey, Alex, I'll also add on to that too, though I'm not on the panel before. As a guy who taught at a schoolhouse and then went to a schoolhouse that was in the process of redoing its POI, you really have to know your stuff in terms of understanding the doctrine as it's written now, and then being able to think outside of the box in the way that you apply it in the future. And also just accept the fact that you're going to run into somebody who might tell you that they're willing to think outside the box, or might tell you that we're doing things differently, but is going to very quickly revert back to the old way or the checklist mentality, because it's very difficult to grade 20 people's essays when everyone is writing about their new theory, and I've got to get you your stuff back tomorrow. And that's just a reality of being an instructor and trying to implement something new where everyone gets to think outside the box and there is no correct answer. So again, I would just argue, you really got to know your stuff, and you just got to form a relationship and be able to talk with your instructor and your professor and say, hey, here's why I think it would work this way. And then be open to people, attacking your idea. And if you can sit there and go, hey, here's why I think this would work in an EABO type concept or an MLR type concept, and you can back it up with what about the future capabilities or the current capabilities or doctrine that you've read, that will help you going forward if that's any help. But it's a difficult road because change is, though constant, very difficult.
If I could just add one thing on the academia piece, a lot touched on the wargaming. I think where academia can be involved in this and unlocking innovation and is using that human capital and that talent in the academia, not just in our NROTC programs and service academies, but in these other academic institutions, especially if they're within proximity of some of these federal research labs, is linking our learning demands as a service, as a Marine Corps, right? We've talked a lot about wargaming and the analytical rigor that needs to go behind answering some of these questions, is matching up those learning demands with the supply, the human capital that's available that could go figure out some of those things or bring it from a different perspective. And I think that's where academia can really contribute, where you can learn by doing and perhaps also deliver a prototype or something that could be tangibly used now or within a few years. For example, Hacking for Defense has been very successful at this, bringing this in. There's other organizations out there that try to synchronize industry, government, and academia, like National Security Innovation Network or Defense Innovation Unit, DIU. For the Marine Corps, very initial operational capability, but Marine Innovation Unit coming online, and especially unlocking the human potential within our reserve component and really bringing in that expertise for things like data analysis, artificial intelligence, robotics. Like there's some key talent within academia and industry that I think we need to bring in to fully mature some of these concepts or to bring some of these prototypes into reality. So I think there's some potential there with academia. Over.
I think, Matt, you've got excellent timing. That's puts us almost right at time for tonight's event. I'm happy to stay on and keep hosting this thing if people want to keep chatting, but we'll call the official part of the event here. I want to thank all the panelists for the great work you did and your presentations, as well as the people who attended and the back and forth. I thought was rich and really reflects the sort of conversation we want to have with the Warfighting Society. So thank you to all of you. And again, I'll stay on for anybody who wants to keep chatting. Otherwise, have a great night or good afternoon or wherever you are.